Good afternoon. We are speaking with John McManus, who is the Vice Chairman, Cushman Wakefield, and also on the Executive Committee of the East Bay Economic Development Alliance, which represents the counties of Alameda and Contra Costa County in the San Francisco Bay Area. And we're excited to talk to you today with your expertise on large site development, the challenges of the older 880 industrial corridor sites, and what are the new emerging industries, especially in the new pandemic era of more logistics, e-commerce, and declining demand for retail and office space.
Thank you, Margot. Demand for industrial space in the East Bay and really all over the country right now is at levels that it has probably never reached before. And that's being driven by a number of things. I think on the coasts, it's access to consumers and specialty manufacturing uses, which include life science. The technology companies here in the Bay Area, people like Google, Apple, Facebook, all have industrial facilities that support their campuses and the things that they do. As you go to the middle of the country, and I know that's not our topic today, but to put things in context, as you go to the middle of the country, we are seeing the effects of onshoring. I think we learned a lot in the pandemic about where our Tylenol comes from and some of the things that we just take for granted. Certainly computer chips is one that gets a lot of attention in the news. And those things are coming back. And so across the country, we're seeing incredible demand for industrial space from users. And then add to that this notion of just-in-time inventory becoming just-in-case inventory. And that was a phrase that got current after 9/11, and we talked about just-in-case. And I don't think we ever really made that transition. We continued to move on a global basis and bring things in just-in-time. This time it is going to be different. We're going to see a lot more things coming onshore and a lot more demand from those groups. Here in the Bay Area, the majority of the demand along the 880 corridor and in close to the Bay has been driven by last mile. And Amazon was out in front of that. They've slowed down over the last year or so. We're talking now in March of 2022. They have slowed down over the last year or two after a very active 18, 19, 20. But that slack has been picked up by other large companies that have come in that want to have their own model. Some of the large chain hardware stores, and I'm not going to be able to name everybody. I've got non-disclosure agreements with some of these folks, but we can all use our imaginations. The large chain retail stores, they want to be able, especially with their large items, think kayaks and washers and dryers and 2x4s, things that you just can't put on a UPS truck or a FedEx truck, but folks are beginning to expect to have delivered to their door. We're seeing people put up depots all over the Bay Area so that they can get things there. And what that's done is drive incredible demand for industrial land. Add on top of that, that the investors who are out there are looking to shift out of things like office space and retail space. I get so many phone calls. We're a $1 billion fund and we've been in office and you've probably heard of us. We'd really like to look into industrial. There's an incredible amount of capital chasing industrial. And you add that up with the demand, and what it's done is really get us to the topic that we're talking about today, which is how do we take these older environmentally challenged sites and put them back into production. Today, in March of 2022, the market is willing to take almost any kind of risk. And so I think as we go through some of the topics that we're going to address, we should think about what's happening today where people are willing to buy sites with PCBs and other issues. Before it was just hydrocarbons. And we should also look forward because there will be a downturn, it's inevitable, and think about some of the tools that we may want to have in a downturn when the private sector isn't quite as ready to move forward. A lot of the uses that we have in the Bay Area are transitional. Those are the existing buildings, the older buildings that folks are finding ways to use. That works really well for the last mile providers that don't need to put in the high cube racks. A modern building today would be 32 or 36 foot clear. Mm-hmm. Some of those older buildings are 18 foot clear, 20 foot clear. Mm-hmm. And so we've got two things going on. One is this incredible demand that we're seeing that's sort of in the moment for e-commerce and different uses. The other is just a secular shift in the way that buildings get used. Most of our built inventory, late 80s through to the early 90s, and even those buildings are becoming obsolete. So There is also a secular change that's going on where a 95-foot truck court, a 20-foot ceiling height, sprinkler systems that are really outdated, that don't pass modern fire codes, those buildings are really at the end of their life cycle. And so you're seeing a couple of factors in play. For those that are environmentally challenged, the interim uses, I think, work especially well for folks that aren't making huge investment in automation and manufacturing equipment. We've certainly seen some cannabis uses go into those buildings where they could find some heavy power. But to the extent that developers can do it today, they're pulling that forward and trying to tear those buildings down. It certainly will take you a couple of years to get through the entitlement process and get through CEQA and all the things that you have to do. But it's certainly the intent. If you look at the Owens, Illinois site here in Oakland, and that may not be 100% industrial by the time they get to the end of their entitlement period, but it will be significantly industrial, as I understand it, because of some of the restrictions they're going to have on use with in-place environmental. The old GE site out on International Boulevard is another great example. That probably wouldn't have been suitable for anything else, maybe some retail uses, but we don't have demand these days for those large-scale retail uses anymore. And that's not an area that could serve a regional audience anyway because of its distance from the freeway and access. And in those cases, you're not talking about interim uses. I mean, those investments are 40 and 50-year investments when you're putting up a brand new tilt-up building like that. That's not an interim use. And so while we do see some interim use, I think when the option is there and the site has the right dimensions and the environmental problem is something that folks can get their arms around, we're going to see that demand get pulled forward and see buildings built, as soon as they can be built. The food industry is going to be a strong driver of demand in the Bay Area. And we're foodies here, right? People enjoy the restaurants, they enjoy the latest thing. And the creative people that create the foods in these alternatives, not to be too provincial, but they don't want to move to Nevada, right? They want to be here and experience the Bay Area culture, while they're experimenting with different things. And I think that's really to our advantage in retaining those uses. There are considerations when you talk about environmentally challenged sites with food users, right? Whether or not you're at risk of having contamination. And honestly, in almost every case with these environmental challenges, they're sub-slab. If they're identified, and they are, you're going to have a soil vapor management system in place, ventilation, monitoring. You're never going to have what's in the groundwater coming in contact with the food. All those things said, there is a perception issue. And if I'm making a food product, I probably don't want to be associated with a site that you can go and see on GeoTracker that has a major problem with it. And so while food will continue to be a driver, I don't think you're going to see anybody by choice move into one of these more challenging environments if they can avoid it. Other uses that would probably fall into that category, we are seeing a lot of life science uses come across the bridge. When they get to the manufacturing phase and you're looking for a CGMP manufacturing facility that needs a large footprint, 50, 60, 80, 100,000 feet, it's very difficult now on the 101 corridor on the peninsula to find a space that's that big, that's also modern and in good shape. And so we build these industrial buildings, they look like warehouse buildings. And when they get put up, you might find that you've got a life science facility, that manufacturing that's going on. You might find one of the electric car manufacturers, and not just Tesla. We're seeing a number of others that are younger that may have gone public through a SPAC or whatever the case may be. Battery technology, there's a use out in the market now, flying cars. There are different autonomous vehicles. There's an autonomous forklift group out. And this is a little off our topic today, but I think at some point you knew I was going to need to make this point or want to make this point. I think sometimes the cities look at these shells and they panic. Oh my gosh, truck traffic. Oh my gosh, low-wage jobs. But if you look at it very, very frequently, you're ending up with a use that is not that is different and something that's much more creative. They have heavier power. But the capital sources aren't going to provide the money unless they know that they can put warehouse in there if that's the only thing that shows up. And so we do have this push-pull. You need to have these shells up, and you could look at Oculus in Newark, Allogene in Newark, Facebook that took a warehouse building to support their campus operations. These things come, Apple comes to the buildings, right? And so you need the space to allow that to happen. And sometimes for the agencies that are giving the approvals, it's a little bit of a risk, but that's a risk that has to be taken to get the buildings up. I think it's critical for these companies to be engaged with the communities that they're going into. And part of that is environmental justice and social justice, but incentives drive organizations and people to do what they do. And the hardest thing for these companies, whether they're local companies or whether they're international, is to find good quality labor. And so the engagement is critical with the community so that people can understand what they're doing there and they can attract the best employees to come in. I think where some of these companies could do more, and there are many that work through the various workforce training groups and work through the EDA, is get early into the communities, especially to the community colleges and the other vocational programs, and make sure they understand the skill sets that are going to be required to make that business successful in the community that it's coming into. And once you're hiring people locally, and those people that come in locally in a labor position move into a supervisory position, you break down those walls between the company and the community. The company is the community is the company. And I'd like to think that that goes on more than we think, but I do know there are people that feel left behind. It's complicated. You know, these jobs, even the simplest material handling job in a warehouse now, it's all very sophisticated in terms of the warehouse management systems, which are all computer-based and tied into databases. And there is a minimum threshold that folks have to get to. And then as you move into the electric vehicles and the autonomous vehicles, and certainly when you talk about life sciences and the manufacturing, there is a technical skill set that needs to be there. And so I do think if there was one suggestion, it would be to have these companies get in earlier to talk about how they can train the community, whether that's community college, high school, or even at the college level, where I fear that we've got kids sometimes taking on loans and have no idea what they're going to do with them or how they're going to be useful when they get out. The funding that we have today from the public sector, the EPA and other places, is tremendous, and it's probably unprecedented. It matches up with all of this activity that's out there from the private sector because there's so much capital sloshing around. In a way, it's unfortunate that the time that we have all this money on the public side is also the time that we have this money on the private side. And so I think we need to look both at what we can do today, and some of that is the educational side that we talked about earlier, where I think it's important that the government, which really controls in some ways a lot of this training activity through the community colleges, through the public schools, stay very active there and encourages a dialogue with private industry so that there's a feedback loop and industry is expressing what they need and folks are moving to fulfill those needs. That's the short term, and I think that's where it's most important. But for those of us who've been doing this for a while, we know that these markets don't last. Whether it's a year from now, whether it's 5 years from now, there'll be a change of some kind. And that's when that public money can be critical. We don't have redevelopment anymore, but for those that are on the environmental side, everybody remembers Polanco and the indemnity and the things that were available. It may be that the way to get these deals over the finish line in 25 or 27 will be through some kind of a write down. And the best way to do that might be with insurance, and maybe there'll be some public funding on an insurance program that doesn't absolve the people that caused the problem of the liability, but will let the people that are coming in to make it better off the hook for things that they clearly didn't do. So whether that's helping to bond, whether that's helping to provide insurance, whether that is working with owners of a site in slow times to better quantify what the real issues are, because oftentimes they'll do a phase one and the owner will understand, hey, I've got a problem, I've got some TCE under the building and I kind of don't want to spend any more money and I might find a bigger problem. And by the way, I don't have the money. That's where the public sector can come in and say, we're going to help you understand how big an issue it is. And that will perhaps get the property ready to go out to market to somebody who's going to put it to a better use. And so it might be pre-marketing, it might be post-sale help, Maybe if you're really getting creative, it's some sort of equity participation where you take a position to help bridge a gap. And then if and when the property goes up in value, well, then the public sector gets to, when the property's in a position and clean enough that a traditional lender can come in, they participate in that, they take out some of the profits, and then they can roll it into the next project. So there are a number of different ways to go about it. I think you've got to reach out to the right people in the real estate community, because there's always reluctance to let the public sector get under the tent. I think folks, a lot of these private owners would prefer to do it on their own. So to the extent that you can find champions in the community to tell that story, or you get those first couple case studies, I think it's very helpful. But I would encourage anybody who's looking at these issues to understand that at this moment in time, the market is so good that folks are looking for reasons to do projects, right? Well, look, we've got this problem over here, and folks will talk themselves into it. Having come into this business in the early 90s and gone through the dot-com crash and the financial crisis, there will also be periods of time where people are looking for reasons not to do something. They see the deal, they think it's a good deal, but they're just trying to talk themselves out of it because it doesn't feel like the right time. And that's the moment that you want to have your tools lined up to help people get over the hump and put these sites back into production. I'm not aware today that there are discussions going on in the public-private. There certainly are brownfield funds and specialty investors, but your more generic property investors, I don't think, are looking to take advantage of these things. And it goes a little bit to what I talked to earlier. There is so much capital sloshing around that folks are willing to take some risk and get out there. I think that kind of workshopping would work very well, where you get public people together with private people. Maybe I have a site in Hayward that I own and it's got an environmental challenge. Maybe you don't sit me down with people from the city of Hayward, because that feels a little bit direct, right? Maybe I meet with somebody from Oakland or Fremont and we just talk, and somebody from San Leandro with the challenge is meeting with someone from Union City, and they're experts on the public side about what the resources are. I'm an expert perhaps in my problem and what a private investor goes through and what I have to deal with my lender. And instead of going right for the specific issue, and this is my property at 123 Main Street, and here's the regulator coming in, it's a little less direct, it's a little less threatening, and it allows people an opportunity to talk without feeling like they're going to be held to what they say in a wide-ranging discussion where they're really, just whiteboard workshop. It might be one way to bring people together, and I think people might feel more comfortable that way. I also think some of the professional organizations like a NAIOP might be able to convene a number of private people, both owners and brokers and those in the architectural and construction community, to really hear what these tools are, because I don't think they're that aware. And I think at this point in time, everybody's running so fast, they may not be looking for them. And that might be a way to really use our imaginations without talking to specific issues. I think that's where private owners get nervous. When you want to talk about their specific environmental challenge on their specific site, that's when you start to feel that pushback. I think brokers play a very important role in connecting owners with resources. It certainly will connect people with lenders, will connect people with environmental firms, will connect them with construction firms. And oftentimes people will come to the real estate brokers with a problem, or maybe they don't realize it's a problem. Some of these owners, it's no big deal. I've been here for 20 years. It's never been a problem for me. And the real estate broker will know right away, no, that's not financeable. And the ability to connect them with someone who's not a regulator and someone who can bring help is critical. So I do think the real estate brokerage community plays a role, but I wouldn't stop there, because I think that, with all respect to the folks in my profession, I think a lot of the developers and folks coming in have a more sophisticated approach to it and have a different approach in terms of understanding the full life cycle of the property, not just at the point of sale, but where they are in getting insurance and where they are in getting financing, and working through all these issues and remediation. And not just what kind of remediation do I have to do, but how long is it going to take? Do I know that it's 12 months or could it be 48 months? And the difference between 12 months and 48 months to have your capital tied up can be quite an issue. So yes, you do want the real estate brokerage community to be in sort of a pivot position to get that information out there, but I wouldn't stop there. I would try to bring in the development community as well, because I think you'd find more willingness to take up the funds and the things that were there.
Thank you so much,
Thank
John.
you.
Appreciate
Yeah.
your time.